South Africa, 1895 to 1933. By 1895, the Transvaal Republic presented an acute problem. All political control was in the hands of a rural, backward, Bible-reading, racist minority of Boers, while all economic wealth was in the hands of a violent, aggressive majority of foreigners, Uitlanders, most of whom lived in the new city of Johannesburg. The Uitlanders, who were twice as numerous as the Boers and owned 2/3 of the land and 9/10 of the wealth of the country, were prevented from participating in political life or from becoming citizens except after 14 years' residence, and were irritated by a series of minor pinpricks and extortions, such as tax differentials, a dynamite monopoly, and transportation restrictions, and by rumors that the Transvaal president, Paul Kruger, was intriguing to obtain some kind of German intervention and protection. At this point in 1895, Rhodes made his plans to overthrow Kruger's government by an uprising in Johannesburg, financed by himself and Beit, and led by his brother, Frank Rhodes, Abe Bailey, and other supporters, followed by an invasion of the Transvaal by a force led by Jameson from Buchanan and Rhodesia. Flora Shaw used the Times to prepare public opinion in England, while Albert Gray and others negotiated with Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain for the official support that was necessary. Unfortunately, when the revolt fizzled out in Johannesburg, Jameson raided anyway, in an effort to revive it, and was easily captured by the Boers. The public officials involved denounced the plot, loudly proclaimed their surprise at the event, and were able to whitewash most of the participants in the subsequent parliamentary inquiry. A telegram from the German Kaiser to President Kruger of the Transvaal, congratulating him on his success in preserving the independence of his country without the need to call for aid from his friends, was built up by the Times into an example of brazen German interference in British affairs, and almost eclipsed Jameson's aggression. Rhodes was stopped only temporarily, but he had lost the support of many of the Boers. For almost 2 years, he and his friends stayed quiet, waiting for the storm to blow over. Then they began to act again. Propaganda, most of it true, about the plight of Uitlanders in the Transvaal Republic flooded England and South Africa from Flora Shaw, W.T. Steed, Edmund Garrett, and others. Milner was made High Commissioner of South Africa, 1897. Brett worked his way into the confidence of the monarchy to become its chief political advisor during a period of more than 25 years. He wrote almost daily letters of advice to King Edward during his reign, 1901 to 1910. By a process whose details are still obscure, a brilliant young graduate of Cambridge, Jan Smuts, who had been a vigorous supporter of Rhodes and acted as his agent in Kimberley as late as 1895, and who was one of the most important members of the Rhodes-Milner group in the period 1908 to 1950, went to the Transvaal and, by violent anti-British agitation, became State Secretary of the country, although a British subject, and chief political advisor to President Kruger. Milner made provocative troop movements on the Boer frontiers, in spite of the vigorous protests of his commanding general in South Africa, who had to be removed, and, finally, war was precipitated when Smuts drew up an ultimatum, insisting that the British troop movements cease, and when this was rejected by Milner. The Boer War, 1899 to 1902, was one of the most important events in British imperial history. The ability of 40,000 Boer farmers to hold off 10 times as many British for 3 years, inflicting a series of defeats on them over that period, destroyed faith in British power. Although the Boer republics were defeated and annexed in 1902, Britain's confidence was so shaken that it made a treaty with Japan in the same year, providing that if either signer became engaged in war with 2 enemies in the Far East, the other signer would come to the rescue. This treaty, which allowed Japan to attack Russia in 1904, lasted for 20 years, being extended to the Middle East in 1912. At the same time, Germany's obvious sympathy with the Boers, combined with the German naval construction program of 1900, alienated the British people from the Germans and contributed greatly toward the Anglo-French Entente of 1904. Milner took over the two defeated Boer republics and administered them as occupied territory until 1905, using a civil service of young men recruited for the purpose. This group, known as Milner's Kindergarten, reorganized the government and administration of the Transvaal and Orange River Colony and played a major role in South African life generally. When Milner left public life in 1905 to devote himself to international finance and the Rhodes enterprises, Lord Selborne, his successor as High Commissioner, took over the kindergarten and continued to use it. In 1906, a new Liberal government in London granted self-government to the two Boer states. The kindergarten spent the next 4 years in a successful effort to create a South African federation. The task was not an easy one. Even with such powerful backing as Selborne, Smuts, who was now the dominant political figure in the Transvaal, although Botha held the position of Prime Minister, and Jameson, who was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony in 1904 to 1908, the subject was broached through a prearranged public interchange of letters between Jameson and Selborne. Then, Selborne published a memorandum, written by Philip Kerr, Lothian, and Lionel Curtis, calling for a union of the four colonies. Kerr founded a periodical, The State, financed by Sir Abe Bailey, which advocated federation in every issue. Curtis and others scurried about organizing closer union societies. Robert H. Lord Brand and Sir Patrick Duncan laid the groundwork for the new Constitution. At the Durban Constitutional Convention, where Duncan and B.K. Long were legal advisors, the Transvaal delegation was controlled by Smuts and the kindergarten. This delegation, which was heavily financed, tightly organized, and knew exactly what it wanted, dominated the convention, wrote the Constitution for the Union of South Africa, and succeeded in having it ratified, 1910. Local animosities were compromised in a series of ingenious arrangements, including one by which the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of the new government were placed in 3 different cities. The Rhodes-Milner Group recognized that Boer nationalism and color intolerance were threats to the future stability and loyalty of South Africa, but they had faith in the political influence of Smuts and Botha, and Rhodes's allies, and of the 4 members of the kindergarten who stayed in South Africa to hold off these problems until time could moderate the irreconcilable Boers. In this they were mistaken, because, as men like Jameson, 1917, Botha, 1919, Duncan, 1943, Long, 1943, and Smuts, 1950, died off, they were not replaced by men of equal loyalty and ability, with the result that the Boer extremists under D.F. Milan came to power in 1948. The first cabinet of the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910 by the South African Party, which was largely Boer, with Louis Botha as Prime Minister. The real master of the government was Smuts, who held 3 out of 9 portfolios, all important ones, and completely dominated Botha. Their policy of reconciliation with the English and of loyal support for the British connection was violently opposed by the Boer nationalists within the party led by J.B.M. Hertzog. Hertzog was eager to get independence from Britain and to reserve political control in a South African republic to Boers only. He obtained growing support by agitating on the language and educational issues, insisting that all government officials must speak Afrikaans and that it be a compulsory language in schools, with English as a voluntary second language. The opposition party, known as Unionists, was largely English, and was led by Jameson, supported by Duncan, Richard Fedham, Hugh Wyndham, and Long. Financed by Milner's allies and the Rhodes Trust, its leaders considered that their chief task was, quote, to support the Prime Minister against the extremists of his own party, unquote, Long, as the best speaker, was ordered to attack Herzog constantly. When Herzog struck back with too violent language in 1912, he was dropped from the cabinet and soon seated from the South African Party, joining with the irreconcilable Boer Republicans like Christian de Wet to form the Nationalist Party. The new party adopted an extremist anti-English and anti-native platform. Jameson's party, under his successor, Sir Thomas Smart, a paid agent of the Rhodes Organization, had dissident elements because of the growth of white labor unions, which insisted on anti-native legislation. By 1914, these formed a separate labor party under F.H.P. Creswell, and were able to win from Smuts a law excluding natives from most semi-skilled or skilled work or any high-paying positions, 1911. The natives were compelled to work for wages, however low, by the need to obtain cash for taxes and by the inadequacy of the native reserves to support them from their own agricultural activities. By the Land Act of 1913, about 7% of the land area was reserved for future land purchases by natives, and the other 93% for purchase by whites. At that time, the native population exceeded the whites by at least fourfold. As a result of such discriminations, the wages of natives were about 1/10 those of whites. This discrepancy in remuneration permitted white workers to earn salaries comparable to those earned in North America, although national income was low and productivity per capita was very low, about $125 per year. The Botha Smuts government of 1910 to 1924 did little to cope with the almost insoluble problems which faced South Africa. As it became weaker and the Herzog nationalists grew stronger, it had to rely with increasing frequency on the support of the Unionist Party. In 1920, a coalition was formed, and 3 members of the Unionist Party, including Duncan, took seats in Smuts' cabinet. In the next election in 1924, Creswell's Laborites and Herzog's Nationalists formed an agreement which dropped the Republican imperial issue and emphasized the importance of economic and native questions. This alliance defeated Smuts' party and formed a cabinet which held office for 9 years. It was replaced in March 1933 by a Smuts-Herzog coalition formed to deal with the economic crisis arising from the World Depression of 1929 to 1935. The defeat of the Smuts group in 1924 resulted from 4 factors, besides his own imperious personality. These were: 1. His violence toward labor unions and strikers. 2. His strong support for the imperial connection, especially during the War of 1914 to 1918. 3. His refusal to show any enthusiasm for an anti-native program. And 4. The economic hardships of the post-war depression and the droughts of 1919 to 1923. A minor strike in 1913 was followed by a general strike in 1914. In both, Smuts used martial law and machine gun bullets against the strikers, and in the latter case, illegally deported 9 Union leaders to England. This problem had hardly subsided before the government entered the war against Germany and actively participated in the conquest of German Africa, as well as in the fighting in France. Opposition from Boer extremists to this evidence of the English connection was so violent that it resulted in open revolt against the government and mutiny by various military contingents which sought to join the small German forces in southwest Africa. The rebels were crushed, and thousands of their supporters lost their political rights for 10 years. Botha, and even more, Smuts, played major roles in the Imperial War Cabinet in London, and at the Peace Conference of 1919. The former died as soon as he returned home, leaving Smuts, as Prime Minister, to face the acute post-war problems. The economic collapse of 1920 to 1923 was especially heavy in South Africa, as the ostrich feather and diamond markets were wiped out. The gold and export markets were badly injured, and years of drought were prevalent. Efforts to reduce costs in the mines by increased use of native labor led to strikes and eventually to a revolution on the Rand, 1922. Over 200 rebels were killed. As a result, The popularity of Smuts in his own country reached a low ebb, just at the time when he was being praised almost daily in England as one of the world's greatest men. These political shifts in South Africa's domestic affairs did little to relieve any of the acute economic and social problems which faced that country. On the contrary, these grew worse year by year. In 1921, the Union had only 1.5 million whites, 4.7 million natives, 545,000 mulattoes, colored, and 166,000 Indians. By 1936, the whites had increased only by 500,000, while the number of natives had gone up almost 2 million. These natives lived on inadequate and corroded reserves, or in horrible urban slums, and were drastically restricted in movements, residence, or economic opportunities, and had almost no political or even civil rights. By 1950, most of the native workers of Johannesburg lived in a distant suburb where 90,000 Africans were corroded onto 600 acres of shacks with no sanitation, with almost no running water, and with such inadequate bus service that they had to stand in line for hours to get a bus into the city to work. In this way, the natives were steadily detribalized, abandoning allegiance to their own customs and beliefs, including religion, without assuming the customs or beliefs of the whites. Instead, they were generally excluded from this because of the obstacles placed in their path to education or property ownership. The result was that the natives were steadily ground downward to the point where they were denied all opportunity except for animal survival and reproduction. Almost half of the whites and many of the blacks were farmers, but agricultural practices were so deplorable that water shortages and erosion grew with frightening rapidity, and rivers which had flowed steadily in 1880 largely disappeared by 1950. As lands became too dry to farm, they were turned to grazing, especially under the spur of high wool prices during the two great wars, but the soil continued to drift away as dust. Because of low standards of living for the blacks, there was little domestic market either for farm products or for industrial goods. As a result, most products of both black and white labor were exported, the receipts being used to pay for goods which were locally unavailable or for luxuries for whites. But most of the export trade was precarious. The gold mines and diamond mines had to dig so deeply, below 7,000-foot levels, that costs arose sharply, while the demand for both products fluctuated widely, since neither was a necessity of life. Nonetheless, each year, over half of the Union's annual production of all goods was exported, with about 1/3 of the total represented by gold. The basic problem was lack of labor, not so much the lack of hands, but the low level of productivity of those hands. This, in turn, resulted from lack of capitalization and from the color bar, which refused to allow native labor to become skilled. Moreover, the cheapness of unskilled labor, especially on the farms, meant that most work was left to blacks, and many whites fell into lazy habits. Unskilled whites, unwilling and unable to compete as labor with the blacks, became indolent poor whites. Milner's kindergarten had, at the end of the Boer War, the sum of £3 million provided by the peace treaty to be used to restore Boer families from concentration camps to their farms. They were shocked to discover that 1/10 of the Boers were poor whites, had no land, and wanted none. The kindergarten decided that this sad condition resulted from the competition of cheap black labor, a conclusion which was incorporated into the report of a commission established by Selborne to study the problem. This famous report of the Transvaal Indigency Commission, published in 1908, was written by Philip Carroll Quigley and republished by the Union government 20 years later. About the same time, the group became convinced that black labor not only demoralized white labor and prevented it from acquiring the physical skills necessary for self-reliance and high personal morale, but that blacks were capable of learning such skills as well as whites were. As Curtis expressed it in 1952, "I came to see how the color bar reacted on whites and blacks, exempt from drudgery by custom and law. Whites acquire no skill in crafts, because the school of skill is drudgery. The blacks, by doing drudgery, acquire skill. All skilled work in mines such as rock drilling was done by miners imported from Cornwall, who worked subject to the color bar. The heavy drills were fixed and driven under their direction by natives. These Cornish miners earned £1 a day, the natives about 25. The Cornish miners struck for higher pay, but the blacks, who in doing the drudgery had learned how to work the drills, kept the mines running at a lower cost." Accordingly, the Milner Roundtable Group worked out a scheme to reserve the tropical portions of Africa north of the Zambezi River for natives under such attractive conditions that the blacks south of that river would be enticed to migrate northward. As Curtis envisioned this plan, an international state or administrative body would take over the British, French, Belgian, and Portuguese dependencies in tropical Africa. Its policy would be to found, north of the Zambezi, a Negro dominion in which blacks could own land, enter professions, and stand on a footing of equality with whites. The inevitable consequence would be that black laborers south of the Zambezi would rapidly immigrate from South Africa and leave South African whites to do their own drudgery, which would be the salvation of the whites. Although this project has not been achieved, it's provided the key to Britain's native and Central African policies from 1917 onward. For example, in 1937 to 1939, Britain made many vain efforts to negotiate a settlement of Germany's colonial claims under which Germany would renounce forever its claims on Tanganyika and be allowed to participate as a member of an international administration of all tropical Africa, including the Belgian Congo and Portuguese Angola, as well as British and French territory, as a single unit in which native rights would be paramount. The British tradition of fair conduct toward natives and non-whites generally was found most frequently among the best educated of the English upper class and among those lower class groups, such as missionaries, where religious influences were strongest. This tradition was greatly strengthened by the actions of the Rhodes-Milner group, especially after 1920. Rhodes aroused considerable ill feeling among the whites of South Africa when he announced that his program included, quote, equal rights for all civilized men south of the Zambezi, and went on to indicate that, quote, civilized men, unquote, included ambitious, literate Negroes. When Milner took over the Boer states in 1901, he tried to follow the same policy. The peace treaty of 1902 promised that the native franchise would not be forced on the defeated Boers, but Milner tried to organize the governments of municipalities, beginning with Johannesburg, so that natives could vote. This was blocked by the kindergarten, led by Curtis, who was in charge of municipal reorganization in 1901 to 1906, because they considered reconciliation with the Boers as a preliminary to a South African Union to be more urgent. Similarly, Smuts, as the chief political figure in South Africa after 1910, had to play down native rights in order to win Boer and English labor support for the rest of his program. The Rhodes-Milner Group, however, was in a better position to carry out its plans in the non-self-governing portions of Africa outside the Union. In South Africa, the three native protectorates of Swaziland, Bucanaland, and Basotholand were retained by the imperial authorities as areas where native rights were paramount and where tribal forms of living could be maintained at least partially. However, certain tribal customs, such as those which required a youth to prove his manhood by undergoing inhuman suffering, or engaging in warfare or cattle stealing before he could marry or become a full-fledged member of the tribe, had to be curtailed. They were replaced in the 20th century by the custom of taking work in the mines of South Africa as contract laborers for a period of years. Such labor was as onerous and killing as tribal warfare had been earlier because deaths from disease and accident were very high. But by undergoing this test for about 5 years, the survivors obtained sufficient savings to allow them to return to their tribes and buy sufficient cattle and wives to support them as full members of the tribe for the rest of their days. Unfortunately, this procedure did not result in good agricultural practices, but rather in overgrazing, growing drought and erosion, and great population pressure in the native reserves. It also left the mines without any assured labor supply, so that it became necessary to recruit contract labor farther and farther north. Efforts by the Union government to set northern limits beyond which labor recruiting was forbidden led to controversy with employers, frequent changes in regulations, and widespread evasions. As a consequence of an agreement made by Milner with Portuguese authorities, about a quarter of the natives working in South African mines came from Portuguese East Africa, even as late as 1936.